Now, the very young and the impressionable should definitely not be watching this program tonight. This is not a Halloween fable. This is a real-life horror story.
Hey, I've been thinking a bit recently about Ari Aster's debut film Hereditary, specifically about the ending. I didn't like it very much, which doesn't exactly put me in a unique field. The ending's been massively argued for and against since the film was released. But I think there are still things about the ending of Hereditary that haven't properly been hashed out yet, and mainly they're to do with genre. See, one of the most common defences for Hereditary is that it's not a generic horror, and in as much as generic is generally used these days as a synonym for bad, that's correct. It's not a bad movie by any stretch of the imagination. It's glossy, it's well produced, well directed, well paced. Its runtime, over 2 hours, which is quite long for a horror film, never once drags, and Toni Collette's performance is every bit as good as people have said it is. But if we take the term generic literally and assume that it means typical of its genre, Hereditary is kind of generic, although not in a bad way. The genre I'm thinking of is what you might call A24 horror. Now granted, not every horror movie I talk about here is going to be distributed by the hugely successful young independent distribution company A24, in much the same way that every vacuum cleaner is a Hoover, even if it's not made by the Hoover company. Every horror movie that's a bit like this feels like an A24 movie. An A24 horror movie is a slow burner. It's supernatural, but it might be psychological. There's a teasing ambiguity. It generally has a restricted location, but a glossy, expensive look. And it tends to focus on a family. The film that Hereditary most reminded me of is Robert Eggers' The Witch, which I happen to think is one of the best of this wave of horrors. In fact, there's a shot towards the end of Hereditary that almost directly parallels the ending of Eggers' film. It's the one where the face of a young cast member is lit by candlelight and shown in extreme close-up, while behind the camera someone explains the last bits of whatever occult conspiracy we've been watching. But the use of this shot in Hereditary made me think that director Ari Aster hadn't understood why Eggers did it in The Witch. There are several reasons why, actually. Most practical among them is the fact that the voice from behind the camera in The Witch is suggested to be coming from a talking goat, and that might look a bit ridiculous if it was on camera.
Wouldst thou like to live deliciously?
The other thing, though, is it refocuses your attention on Thomasin, the character played excellently by Anya Taylor-Joy. It makes you think about her face, her expressions, what's going on inside that head of hers, which is exactly where the battleground of The Witch has been all along. In an early shot in The Witch, we see that the family's crops have failed. They've grown a mould, which any student of historical witch panics will tell you is meant to evoke ergot, a fungus that grew on failing crops. Ergot is quite similar in its chemical composition to LSD, and it has been theorised that historically cases of mass possession and mass hysteria have been down to this fungus. There is a reason why, in witch trials, one of the main allegations against witches is they caused the crops to fail. Every witch panic, it seems, followed a bad harvest. And the question throughout The Witch is this what's happening? Or is there a supernatural aspect to it? And for much of Hereditary, the question is the same. When we're introduced to Annie, the Toni Collette character, she's grieving, she's clearly in a very troubled emotional state, she's lying to her husband about going to grief counselling, which tells you that there's a bit more going on here than just a bereavement. And for most of the film, the question is, Are we watching this woman's mental disintegration, or are we watching her discover a supernatural conspiracy? Every time the film's supernatural content gets bumped up, it's Annie who discovers it, leaving it teasingly unresolved as to whether the other characters can see this or not, or whether it's just in her head. At least it does until the ending, where Annie suddenly starts to become framed as a monster. We start to see her solely as a threat to her son Peter, played by Alex Wolff, who has been a sympathetic character throughout, but nowhere near the protagonist that Annie's been. Annie is photographed in ways that recall villains and paranormal apparitions from films and TV shows like Whistle and I'll Come to You, The Last Exorcism, Garth Marenghi's Dark Place. I can sort of see why Astor thought this was a good idea. I think he might be going for something like the effect at the end of Nicholas Roeg's Don't Look Now, when we suddenly realise that Donald Sutherland's character is not the hero of a ghost story, he's the anonymous victim in a slasher movie, and we feel his death ever more keenly because of the unfairness of having his story ripped away from us just as we'd become involved in it. But I think Don't Look Now works better because even though it has a radical genre shift, it still answers the central question the audience has been asking all along, namely, is that child in the red coat really the ghost of Sutherland's character's dead daughter? The ending makes it very clear that no, she really isn't. It's a jolt, but it's a jolt that plays fair by the audience. By contrast, in Hereditary, all of the questions we've been asking about whether this is all in Annie's mind become irrelevant in the end because the story isn't about Annie, it's about her son, and that subjectivity emphasising close-up borrowed from The Witch is meant to reinforce it. But it doesn't. There's only one moment in the whole film where Annie has previously been painted as a threat, and that's the scene where she admits to trying to introduce a miscarriage when she was pregnant with Peter. But even that scene turns out to be a nightmare Annie is having. Even the one scene where she is presented as a threat to Peter, which is what the ending is about, goes back to Annie's own subjectivity and psychological state. I think there's also a problem with what genre Hereditary is trying to shift from and to. Don't Look Now goes from a ghost story, which we understand, to a slasher movie, which we understand. Hereditary is trying to go from an A24 horror movie, which is a genre that isn't quite laid down yet, to a satanic horror movie. And there's a problem with satanic horror movies. And to find out what that is, we're going to have a brief history of Satanism. So it's hard to tell where the idea of Satanism comes from. There is no historical tradition of a cult that worshipped the devil in the same way that Christians worship their god or other religions worship their gods. It might come down a bit to the allegations against the Knights Templar during the Crusades. Now, the Knights Templar are commonly talked about in conspiracy theories, but in fact, they were some of the better soldiers during the Crusades. They were devout but not fanatical. They fought hard, but they were not sadistic. This good conduct led to them getting more and more commissions and wealthy patrons until eventually people started to resent that quite a lot, and they were subject to some unfounded allegations of anti-Christian conduct. Some of the allegations against the Knights Templar seem quite familiar from contemporary satanic panics. They were accused of performing rituals that were blasphemous parodies of Christian rites. They were accused of kissing each other on the genitals and buttocks. In a recent article for 14 Times, Christopher Joseph suggests there is an even closer link, which is that the name of Baphomet, the goat-headed god that satanic cults purportedly worship, might be a corruption of Mahomet, an archaic pronunciation of Muhammad. The Knights Templar were not being accused of worshipping the devil, in Joseph's opinion. They were being accused of going to the other side. Now, over the centuries and over the course of several inquisitions and witch scares and satanic scares, the idea of mass organised Satanism as a conspiracy where all of the powerful people get together, have a black mass, abuse some kids, sacrifice some virgins and cover it all up because they're so powerful, became cemented. You can still see this formula work in the satanic ritual abuse scare of the 1980s, which has left a considerable cinematic footprint, although not one that's going to feature in any list of the greatest horror movies ever made.
Well-organized satanic groups are creating a reign of death and destruction. There may be as many as 60,000 human sacrifices per year in this country.
Which is a shame, because some of this is terrifying. Fantasies of black masses taken straight from a Dennis Wheatley novel were mixed with vague, inconsistent witness testimonies to produce a fantasy of Satanists operating all over the world, murdering and torturing without, strangely, ever leaving any human remains.
They would dismember bodies and then hang me upside down over a vat. I think it was acid, I'm not sure.
When Mr. Poo Pants goes to the witch parties, well, he's horrible. Why? Because he's the boss. Yes, I'm Mr. Brown, because they say, children, come here. Children, come here, what do you mean?
In the official British government report on the matter, Professor Jean Lafontaine records the case of a group of social workers who overheard children in their care talking about a mysterious black-cloaked figure. They decided that it must be evidence of a black mass. What they missed out was that the children identified the figure as Batman.
Other symbols of Satan are the letters ACDC, which stand for Antichrist, Devil Child.
Rebellion against authority, self-righteousness, disrespect towards parents, they're common in the growing up years. They're also signs of involvement in satanic cults.
Symptoms characterizing satanic ritual abuse and sexual abuse in preschool-aged children. The child mistrusts adults. The child is over-compliant with authority.
The first modern satanic novel, in my opinion, is J.K. Huysman's La Basse, which variously translates as The Damned or simply Down There. La Basse is first of a series of 4 novels Huysman wrote about the character de Tal, stand-in for the author who starts La Basse writing a book about the infamous child murderer of an occultist Gilles de Rais. After going deep into the satanic underworld and being horrified by what he finds, and it has to be said, La Basse is still a very shocking book over a century later, he repents. And this begins the cycle which is tracked out in the subsequent 3 novels where, like Huysman's himself, de Tal moves towards Catholicism. But in Britain, La Basse was generally interpreted through the lens of Huysman's previous association with the decadent movement. It was seen as a transgressive shocker, which fair enough it is, but the later novels, which sketched out de Tal's moral awakening, were little read. La Basse is still the most popular of the series to this day. So what were the people reacting to in this incomplete story which doesn't get to the end point Huysman's was intending to? Well, if we're honest, they're reacting to the salaciousness. Satanism in fiction has always been kind of about sex, specifically about a fear of sex, a fear that other people might be getting up to some very kinky, weird stuff and they should stop it, but preferably after you've got all of the sexy details of it.
Another area we'll want to note is the foot area.
Eric Pryor is a former satanic high priest turned Christian who now spends his time educating people about the dark side of satanic cults.
There's 2 different communities that use this park. One is the pagan or occultic community, and the other community is, of course, the homosexual community. Interestingly enough, they go hand in hand.
Flagellation, a story of corporal punishment, the evils of flogging, birching.
Members of satanic or occult groups share common traits, such as access to perform perverted sex acts, such as homosexuality, bisexuality, sodomy.
This is the way occultists tell each other, hey, we're Satanists, and we're partying.
The first major depiction of a satanic cult in cinema was Benjamin Christensen's Haxan, a very impressive, handsomely mounted Danish film which tacks weirdly between trying to debunk historic stories of Satanism and vividly dramatising them in a completely unforgettable way. Perhaps more characteristic of the direction screen Satanism would take, though, was not Christensen's expensive, lavish, high-minded project, but an anonymously made short called simply Black Mass, which reproduces what a satanic mass was thought to involve through the medium of silent-era hardcore pornography. I haven't included a clip from it because I quite like having a YouTube channel. And so the link between sex and Satanism goes on. Gerard Damiano, the director of Deep Throat, made a film called Legacy of Satan, which he actually intended as a porn film, but changed to a horror film during production. Now, other horror genres, you would think, would need a bit of work to turn them into a porno film, but satanic horror? Not so much, it turns out. Here's how an actual horror film, which was planned as a horror film and was meant to have no pornographic element whatsoever, dramatises a Black Mass. This is from Curse of the Crimson Altar. It's horrifying, isn't it? It could be an Ann Summers party that's got a bit out of hand. Now, the fact that satanic horror is rooted in a kind of phobia of sex doesn't make the genre bad or reactionary in and of itself. The zombie genre originally existed because people thought the Caribbean was a dark, scary land of hidden dangers. Now people think it's a lovely holiday destination. But zombie horror is still potent, largely because George A. Romero saw the genre, took out all of the bits of it that were xenophobic or superstitious or just plain embarrassing and dated, and turned it into something which is still capable of scaring us today. Some movies have done this with satanic horror. The Omen simply gets rid of the sexual element altogether. Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist locate it in aspects of sexual behaviour, rape and childhood sexuality respectively, that are still disturbing to this day. The strange thing about Hereditary is it doesn't really try to do this. Its visualisation of the cult at the end is far more Curse of the Crimson Altar than it is The Exorcist. Are we seriously expected to be scared by naked middle-aged suburbanites in masks? Are we meant to think that's a horrifying vision of moral depravity, rather than a quiet afternoon at a swingers club in Surbiton? Like I say, I don't think Hereditary is a bad film. I think it's an actually good film that has one glaring bad element that is, at least, bad in a really fascinating way that I can dig into. And it has one constant theme that offers me a lot of hope for Asta's future. Throughout the film there are echoes of ancient tragedies, talk about the machinations of the gods. The story in the end becomes one of possession. Everything from the title through to the end credits is about this idea of things being passed down. And Asta makes this scary not because it's blasphemous, which is what previous possession stories expected us to be scared by. The world of Hereditary is nothing if not a very secular, liberal, upmarket one, which makes it even weirder that Annie tried to force a miscarriage rather than get an abortion. But okay, this is an American film that's trying to get into multiplexes and they can't even say that word. What Hereditary says is scary about possession now is that it negates our faith in free will. It negates our faith in us as individuals. It says that we are ultimately playthings in the hands of people who are much more powerful than us. And that makes that idea scary again. I wish he could have done the same with Satanism.
When this is accomplished, you can be confident that children will grow into happy, well-adjusted, and productive citizens, free from satanic and occultic influences.